0. 38 hours. September 26, 1983. Serpukhov 15, near Moscow. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov adjusted his headset inside the Oko Satellite Early Warning Command Center. Outside, the Russian night was silent. Inside, the room hummed with the low-frequency thrum of thermal printers and status lights. Then a new light blinked red. The alert klaxon didn't scream. It simply pulsed. A message slid across the console: Start 1 missile launch detected. 1 ICBM, launched from the United States. Trajectory inbound. Estimated time to impact 25 minutes. Petrov didn't move. He looked at the technician. No radar confirmation, no secondary satellite, just a single detection from Oko's infrared platform. He reported the detection as under analysis. 2 minutes later, a second launch appeared. Then 3, 4, 5 Minuteman missiles, all heading toward Soviet targets. Petrov's training said this was a first strike. Doctrine said confirm and report. Protocol said launch retaliation now. But something felt wrong. 5 missiles. Not 500. No chatter on intercept lines. No panic in other command centers. No radar pings. No atmospheric flash from early horizon. Just a blinking red light. Petrov froze, not in fear, but in calculation. If he was wrong, Moscow would burn. If he was right and launched, the world would end over a software glitch. He made the call false alarm and waited. No missiles came. No war began. Only silence. That night, one blinking light almost triggered the end of the world, and only one man's refusal to believe a machine stopped it. Beneath the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, the General Staff War Room was a cathedral of conviction. Dozens of terminals tracked missile trajectories, NATO flight paths, and early warning alerts. Massive wall displays glowed with satellite feeds, radar overlays, and encrypted command queues. Doctrine here wasn't debated, it was executed. If the United States launched a first strike, the Soviet Union would retaliate immediately. There would be no negotiation, no wait and see. That wasn't paranoia. That was survival. Launch on warning was the foundation of Soviet nuclear posture. Trust the machines, trust the protocols. Human hesitation was seen as a risk, not a virtue. Quote, number 1. A senior general once said the button is readiness, delay is defeat. Inside this room, Oko was gospel. The early warning satellite system could detect the infrared heat plume of a US ICBM seconds after launch. It had taken years to build. Billions of rubles, backed by the full weight of Soviet space infrastructure. Quote, Nunker 2 American missiles cannot hide from our eyes in the sky, said Marshal Akhromeyev. The belief was unshakable. If the screen says launch, missiles are coming. If the signal is clean, the threat is real. And if war is to begin, it begins with a red light and a confirmation code. Credential drop. Were one Marshal Sergei Akhromeyev, Chief of the General Staff in 1983, personally approved the final launch on confirmation doctrine that governed Petrov's command chain. And yet, on the night of September 26th, the system showed 5 American ICBMs inbound. The room expected a report, a confirmation, a counter-launch code. Instead, it got silence. Petrov didn't report the launch. He stalled, he questioned, he hesitated, and in that hesitation, the room's certainty cracked for a moment. Dramatic irony. They believed human error was the danger. But it was human judgment that saved them. The Soviet nuclear strategy of the early 1980s was engineered for speed. Not diplomacy, not verification. Speed. It was built on one terrifying concept: launch on warning. If American missiles were detected, Soviet retaliation had to begin before the first warheads hit Soviet soil. Any delay, even a minute, risked decapitation of command. The system wasn't designed to wait for explosions. It was designed to trust its sensors. 2 layers guarded the homeland Oko satellite network, watching for infrared launches. Daryl and Dnieper ground radar, confirming trajectory from Earth. The logic was mathematical. Satellites saw heat, ground radar saw motion. If both agreed, retaliation was automatic. Soviet assumptions: American ICBMs would come in waves, not singles. False positives were technically impossible. If Oko saw it, it was real. Credential drop, Circle 2. The 1981 Soviet Military Doctrine Manual stated plainly, any doubt during confirmed warning is equivalent to sabotage. Commanders had seconds to respond. From detection to counter-launch, the window was barely 15 minutes. That urgency was baked into the structure. Strategic rocket forces were on permanent alert. Launch codes pre-authorized for retaliatory execution. Missiles primed to fire upon dual confirmation, Oko plus radar. In that system, hesitation wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Fatal assumption. The system assumed that the greatest threat was human error. So it removed the human, and yet, on September 26th, only a human saw the flaw. Oko signaled Armageddon. Radar saw nothing. Petrov didn't act, not because of failure, because the pattern didn't make sense. 5 missiles, not a first strike, no radar confirmation, not credible, no political context, not possible. He trusted logic over protocol, and logic saved the world from a war his superiors were prepared to fight over a blinking light. 038. The screen flashed red, start 1. 039. Petrov leaned in. 1 missile. Trajectory North Dakota to Moscow, 040. He stood up. Issued initial alert to backup command, 041. Second missile detected, then third, fourth, fifth, 042. Entire room froze. 5 missiles on screen, 043. System flagged full confidence. Protocol required reporting confirmed strike, 0044. Petrov said 2 words, false alarm. 0045. Radar station Kapustin Yar. No detection. No objects. 0046. Petrov rechecked satellite signal angles. Too shallow. 047. Air Force liaison demanded confirmation. Petrov replied, we wait. 048. Countdown neared decision threshold. Launch on warning window, 9 minutes remaining. 050. Still no radar confirmation. No communication anomalies. 052. Missiles vanish from Oko screen, never real. 054. Silence across the room. No war. Everyone stared at the consoles. Nothing had happened, but something enormous had almost begun. Petrov took off his headset. His hands were shaking. In his post-incident statement, he wrote, there was no logic in 5 missiles. If America strikes, it will be all out. This was wrong. Credential drop, Thunder 3. He held no radar training. He wasn't an engineer. But as Deputy Chief of Combat Algorithms, Petrov knew how the system thought. And something that night had triggered a contradiction. Radar said no. Satellites said yes. His instinct said if they were launching, I would feel the world change. But the world hadn't changed. And in that contradiction, the system cracked. Not because a sensor failed, but because the man didn't. When the incident was reported up the chain, the response was cold and bureaucratic. There was no recognition, no commendation, only questions and suspicion. Why didn't you report the launch? Why did you override protocol? Was the system malfunctioning, or the operator negligent? Petrov's answer that the situation lacked internal logic was met with silence. The General Staff viewed the delay not as heroism, but as hesitation. In their eyes, if the system said missiles were inbound, that was reality. To challenge the machine was to challenge Soviet engineering and Soviet certainty. The internal review, chaired by mid-level officers from the strategic rocket forces, issued a sterile verdict system performed as designed. Operator failed to follow escalation procedure. Petrov was quietly reassigned. No promotion, no medal, just absence. Credential drop 44. In his memoirs, a former Ministry of Defense official recalled, there was no room in our system for instinct, only execution. Higher-ranking commanders refused to update the protocol. They didn't want to admit that a single fault in a single sensor could almost end the world. Instead, they blamed operator stress and called it a training issue. A new rule was added. Future duty officers must report all OCO alerts without interpretation. The idea of doubt was erased. The incident became taboo, discussed only in whispers, a near catastrophe, hidden to protect confidence, ideology over introspection, because in a system built on absolute belief in technology, admitting one man's judgment saved the planet was too dangerous to accept. So Moscow rejected the truth and filed the near-apocalypse under operator error. In the days that followed the near-apocalyptic incident, a team of engineers from the Ministry of Radio Industry and the Soviet Space Surveillance Agency was quietly summoned to examine the OCO satellite system. Their task wasn't to publicize Petrov's decision, it was to find a technical excuse. They proposed a simple answer solar reflection. According to their preliminary report, the sun had aligned at a rare angle behind the U.S. missile fields in North Dakota. Its light, reflecting off high-altitude cloud layers, had produced a flare detectable by OCO's infrared sensors. This glare, they theorized, mimicked the heat signature of missile launches. The explanation was elegant, non-threatening, contained. It allowed the command structure to preserve faith in the system without acknowledging a critical vulnerability in their doctrine. The ministry published an internal bulletin signal anomaly detected. Environmental interference probable. Satellite alignment correction underway. No mention of Petrov. No mention of launch protocol. No mention of the world nearly ending. Behind closed doors, specialists debated the theory's limitations. Problem number 1. The same alignment had occurred before without incident. Problems of 2. Only one satellite in the OCO constellation triggered the alarm. Others showed no anomaly. Problems number 3. Ground-based radar failed to detect anything, even after being placed on maximum alert. Despite these contradictions, the explanation was adopted because it fit the narrative. The sun was a known variable. Easy to blame. Easier to fix. Credential drop. Number 5. A classified OCO program review read, Update heliocentric algorithms to reduce solar flare misidentification by 87%. It sounded precise, technical, safe, and it gave the appearance of action without addressing the deeper flaw that the entire system relied on binary input. Missile or no missile. War or no war. There was no space for uncertainty, no protocol for wait, no category for unconfirmed. So they adjusted the math, not the doctrine. And Petrov's decision remained an unspoken anomaly, a ghost in a machine that refused to admit it ever blinked. While solar reflection remained the official explanation, a competing theory quietly emerged within Soviet intelligence circles, one that shifted the blame not to the environment, but to the enemy. Some in the GRU and KGB proposed that the Americans had conducted a deliberate test, a strategic feint using decoy launches or radar spoofing to test Soviet response times. The theory suggested that the U.S. had simulated a missile attack without triggering traditional detection methods. Perhaps an experimental ICBM launch with suppressed thermal signature, or maybe radar invisible re-entry vehicles, launched from submerged submarines or high-altitude aircraft. This explanation held powerful appeal for Soviet hardliners. The Americans are probing us, one internal GRU memo warned. They're testing our nerves, our systems, our doctrine. The theory was aggressive. It painted the USSR not as the victim of a system glitch, but as the target of an American psychological operation. Credential drop, Sir 6. An October 1983 internal GRU dispatch activity at U.S. Strategic Air Command inconsistent with routine, possible indirect provocation. The implications were enormous. If true, it meant Petrov's hesitation had not only avoided nuclear war, but had potentially saved the USSR from responding to an elaborate American trap. but the theory collapsed under scrutiny. Problems over 1. U.S. Strategic command logs from declassified sources in later years show no launch, no drill, no anomaly. Problem Nordker 2. NATO surveillance data shared via back channels showed routine activity across all U.S. nuclear commands. Problem number 3. No radar or ELINT confirmation of any vehicle, aircraft, or submarine deployment that could match the supposed ghost launch. Even so, within certain political factions, the theory persisted. Because, like the solar flare model, it offered a reassuring narrative the system worked. The problem wasn't Soviet design, it was American deception. As a result, the Soviet military-industrial complex doubled down on counter-deception tools, radar spoof filters, optical scramblers, and improved decoy recognition algorithms. None of these addressed the core issue. Because in both false solutions, sun flares or enemy tricks, the common thread remained. They refused to accept that a single system failure, unchecked, could lead to global destruction. Worse, they refused to accept that a single officer's doubt had saved them all. As panic faded and blame scattered, the Soviet intelligence community launched a full-scale internal review under the codename Verisk. The GRU, KGB, and military-industrial surveillance units were all tasked with one mission: find the flaw. But almost immediately, the review hit a wall. The OCO system's telemetry data was stored in fragmented blocks across secure compartments. Engineers from Lavochkin, the satellite contractor, could only access partial logs. The Defense Ministry's central server logs contradicted field reports, and Petrov himself, the only human in the room that night, was never formally debriefed beyond a single post-incident report. Compartmentalization had become blindness. The radar stations had logged no anomalies. NORAD communications intercepts from the U.S. showed no changes in posture. And ELINT intercepts signals intelligence that should have picked up any missile command signals recorded silence. Credential drop, number 7. A 1984 classified KGB memo concluded, "We collect everything, but we understand nothing. The data is perfect. The insight is absent." In desperation, GRU analysts began comparing false alarm cases across the OCO system. They found anomalies. 1979 phantom reading dismissed as a sensor test glitch. A 1982 single-frame flare during a satellite shift. Minor discrepancies in solar angle compensation logs, each one ignored. None escalated. The picture became clear not of technical failure, but conceptual failure. The Soviet system had the data, but lacked the framework to interpret it safely. It could detect a thermal spike, but couldn't cross-verify across space, radar, and logic. There was no doctrine for contradiction, and no room for a man like Petrov trained in logic, but forbidden to use it. Worse still, the OCO system continued operating with no confirmed correction to its binary threat detection. The next officer might not question the light. The next alert might be taken as truth. When the Verisk investigation concluded, the final document was stamped Top Secret Limited View and quietly buried in an archive vault. Its final sentence read, "Strategic stability currently rests not on hardware, but on the instincts of isolated men." It wasn't just a blackout of data. It was a blackout of accountability, of understanding, and of truth. While the Soviet Union struggled with false positives, buried investigations, and a doctrine that treated hesitation as heresy, the United States was undergoing a transformation of its nuclear early warning architecture, one built not on speed, but on redundancy, skepticism, and human override, where Soviet command emphasized launch speed and sensor trust. U.S. strategy emphasized multi-confirmation, cross-domain input, and deliberate decision-making. Technology 1, DSP satellites, Defense Support Program. While the USSR had OCO, The U.S. operated DSP infrared satellites in geosynchronous orbit, unlike OCO, which reported alerts directly to launch authorities. DSP alerts were routed through NORAD and cross-checked against multiple inputs. Soviet expectation satellites give binary answers, launch or no launch. American reality DSP flags possible launches but requires confirmation. Why it worked. Prevents single-point failure. Combat example. In 1979, a U.S. training tape triggered a NORAD alert. DSP did not confirm. Retaliation paused. Technology 2, BMS ballistic missile early warning system, massive radar stations at Thule, Greenland, Fylingdales, UK, and Clear Alaska scanned for ICBMs entering North American airspace. Soviet expectation radar is confirmation. American reality radar must match satellite data and be evaluated by human analysts. Why it worked. Redundant systems prevent automation from dominating. Combat example. In 1980, BMEW's radar detected missiles but software glitch. DSP saw nothing. Crisis diffused. Technology 3, human command deliberation. Nuclear posture required two-man rule, multiple confirmation steps, and presidential authority a buffer against panic. Soviet expectation, rapid retaliation is strength. American reality, deliberate confirmation prevents disaster. Why it worked, avoids accidental apocalypse. Combat example 1979 training alert went to Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor. He waited for radar confirmation before waking the president. Technology 4, strategic defense protocols. U.S. systems were designed to absorb a first strike, not necessarily respond instantly. Soviet expectation delay, incursion defeat. American reality survivability and counter-strike capacity provide time for verification. Why it worked, encouraged second strike logic over preemptive panic. Combat example. Your stupid nuclear triad ensured submarines could retaliate, even if land assets were destroyed. Technology 5 false alarm audits. The U.S. treated every false alarm as a systems failure to be dissected. Soviet expectation hide flaws, blame operators, American reality public hearings, system redesign, transparency where possible. Why it worked flaws became lessons, not secrets. Combat example. After the 1980 and 1983 alerts, U.S. upgraded software, procedures, and communications safeguards. Credential drop, Infoshugarner 8. In a 1984 Pentagon briefing, an official stated, "Our goal is not perfect detection. It's perfect restraint under imperfect conditions." Progressive scoring. Soviet System 1. 1 sensor for 1 threat. U.S. System 3+ sensors. Threat confirmation. Soviet response time 10-15 minutes. U.S. decision window variable with safeguards. The United States didn't win the nuclear chess match with faster moves. It won by refusing to treat the board as binary. It didn't bet on the machine. It bet on people who questioned the machine. And in 1983, that choice made all the difference. 0038. OCO satellite detects first missile launch from U.S. 0039. Petrov acknowledges alert but withholds escalation. 0040. 4 more launches appear on screen. 0041. Petrov breaks protocol labels signal false alarm. 0042. Command center waits for confirmation. 0043. Radar shows nothing. Radio traffic is silent. 0044. Officers watch the clock, expecting war. 0052. Alert window expires, no missiles. 0054. Calm resumes, but nothing is the same. In under 20 minutes, the entire strategic nuclear doctrine of the Soviet Union was reduced to a single human decision, and it didn't hold up. Later that week, a report reached General Staff Headquarters. It concluded that the system had performed according to parameters. The failure was human. It did not acknowledge that Petrov's failure had prevented global thermonuclear war. Progressive scoring of the collapse 1. Error OCO false signal. 5 missiles triggered a full alert. 0 Gaonis. 0 confirmations. No radar, no telemetry. 1 man stopped a nuclear response. 0 consequences for Outsu, for the world. The system that was designed to retaliate before destruction had nearly caused destruction without provocation. Reversal Ashkara 1. They believed instant retaliation meant strength. They stopped believing that when hesitation meant survival. Reversal Dungar 2. They mocked human doubt as weakness. They stopped mocking when doubt stopped apocalypse. Reversal Dungar 3. They trusted machines absolutely. They stopped trusting after a machine nearly ended civilization. Credential drop Dargar 9. Petrov's name was erased from the official incident log. But his commanding officer privately told him, "If you had followed the rules, we might not be standing here." This was not a glitch. This was doctrine collapsing in real time. Everything the Soviet Union believed about command, response, and deterrence had failed under the weight of a false signal and a man who refused to obey. It wasn't that the system broke. It was that the system worked and still brought the world to the brink. In the months after the incident, deep within the Soviet Strategic Command, a small group of senior analysts and military scientists gathered to ask a forbidden question. What if the system isn't broken? What if it was never enough to begin with? The Oko false alarm had exposed not just a vulnerability, but a fault line running through the entire logic of Soviet nuclear doctrine. They identified 4 catastrophic philosophical failures. 1. Automation over judgment. Soviet systems were built to remove the human element. Response time was sacred. If a missile warning appeared, retaliation followed. Period. But the 1983 event revealed that judgment-human hesitation was the only thing that prevented nuclear annihilation. Soviet, quote, "We built a system that obeys without thinking. It nearly killed us." 2. Certainty over verification. The doctrine assumed that if Oko saw it, it was true. No need to wait for radar. No need for cross-domain confirmation. But in reality, a satellite flare, a software bug, or a misread sunbeam could look like Armageddon. Soviet, quote, "We made faith a policy, and it blinded us." 3. Speed over survivability. The USSR believed only a rapid response could prevent decapitation. The system prioritized firing before the enemy's missiles hit. But this logic ignored second-strike deterrence and the survivability of mobile platforms. Soviet, quote, "We feared delay more than destruction. We chose speed over sense." 4. Systems over context. The belief in technological precision meant context political, strategic, even emotional was excluded from the launch equation. On September 26th, the United States had made no threats, no movements, no deployments. But the machine didn't know that. It only knew light and trajectory. Soviet, quote, "The system saw missiles. The world saw nothing." Credential drop. 10. A 1984 restricted white paper titled Doctrine Review. Strategic autonomy and risk management circulated briefly among Soviet general staff. Its conclusion: "We cannot automate apocalypse. We must rethink what trust means in machines." But no formal change was made. Petrov's incident remained unofficial. The doctrine remained intact. The silence preserved. Yet for those few who had read the full report, the truth could not be unlearned. They had built a perfect machine for ending the world, and only luck or conscience had stopped it from running. A black terminal, blinking red, an empty swivel chair at Serpukhov 15, a printout in faded ink Start 1 confirmed. These weren't just pieces of obsolete hardware. They were relics from a moment when history balanced on hesitation. The chair was not just for sitting. It was the fulcrum of fate. The printout was not just a report. It was the breath before catastrophe. The terminal was not just a machine. It was the voice of a system that had no ears, no doubts, and no soul. Stanislav Petrov never wore medals for what he didn't do. He was not honored by parades. His act, the decision to do nothing, was never celebrated in Moscow, but what he chose not to do may have saved hundreds of millions. In later years, when asked what gave him pause, he said, "Missiles don't come in fives. They come in hundreds. That was my logic. Logic. Not faith. Not protocol. Not orders." The Cold War was fought with machines that promised certainty. It ended again and again not with detonations, but with moments of pause, moments when individuals broke from code and listened to doubt. Final image. The red light blinks alone. The screen is dark. The room is empty. The system still waits for a response. But that night, in 1983, the world kept turning because a man refused to turn a key. It was not just a false alarm. It was a window into how fragile peace had become. A reminder that civilization's survival depended not on missiles or metal, but on a sliver of human judgment inside a fortress of automation. Final line. The Cold War wasn't stopped by missiles. It was stopped by a man who didn't trust the light.